Edward, thank you very much for joining me to have a quick conversation about polarization and ways to use it to create a healthy outcomes and use it in conflict in a healthy way. This is in advance of our next dialogue, which is on the 15th of July, where you're going to be the speaker. So I've got a couple of questions to take you through, if that's okay.
Great, sounds great. Thanks, Tom. I'm really looking forward to it.
So the subject of this talk is about the power of polarity. So what does that mean exactly?
If we think really very simply about, electric charge and batteries, things like that, there's opposite ends, and between them is a charge. And that difference is both scary and appealing. It can be very attracting, and it can also be very hurtful and strong and potentially violent. And so there is a power in polarity. And I think there's sort of two sides to the coin, interestingly enough, which is one is that I think if I'm going to talk about this, I want to talk about both sides of the polarity, right? How we can use it and how it's dangerous, because it's both. And if you've heard of the binary bias, right? Under pressure or under threat, when presented with new information, we often see that in terms of binary. I'm right and you're wrong. It's this way, not that way. And our mind tends to find the clarity of one particular view as opposed to one other particular view fortifying and therefore comfortable and appealing. So, it's actually kind of built into a bias we have, is to approach problems with a binary lens. And, if we're not seeing that, we're seeing that really uprooted in a lot of the gender conversations about how inadequate the binary can be. So, but there is a propensity to make things a binary choice.
Yeah.
And I think we have to be aware of that and then go, are we willing to look in between it? Or if I am going to go with the binary and that polarity, how do I work with it? And I always say that the first thing is to realize which one you're in. And then to decide whether this polarity is worth fighting for. And if so, how can I work with it? Or can I dare to be somewhere in the gray, which is a big risk, both to our mental models, but also to our understanding of the world and sometimes to our identity, if things have really core polarity.
Yeah, I think it's useful for people to understand where you're coming from in terms of this word polarity. I always remember when I did my master's, we talked about constructs. And again, that was that bipolar model. It's either this or it's that, and what's the continuum between the two. But moving on, do you think the business world is more polarized than ever? And how does this impact inclusion at work?
I mean, that's a big statement, isn't it? I mean, the business world is lots of things. I mean, there's the business as it was pre-COVID, and there's business as it will be, as it is now, and what's happened. I mean, the transformation that was already coming is huge. And, are we even in a place to be depolarized in business? That's a tough question. I think if you think about public discourse and how that might show up in business, I think there is a danger that people are tending to polarize more easily. And my view on that is because we're facing huge amounts of uncertainty, and those polarities give us a sense of clarity. And that clarity gives us some kind of respite in amidst all of the unknowns that are currently happening. And so at one level, yes, is it just the business world? The business world sits in so many positions, but it's definitely influenced by what's in the public domain.
Yeah. And that takes me on to I think there's an underlying message that you're saying there, but without using the word, and it's fear. So do you think that fear is at the heart of polarity and conflict?
I definitely think it contributes to it. But I think because we're so inclined to go to polarity, it isn't always fear driven. But I would say that uncertainty, which could definitely feel scary, would push a sort of polarized view.
You know, in your second answer, you talked about the people craving the certainty, knowing, and it's a very simplistic approach to a very complex world. And it seems to me that when you have uncertainty, then the natural reaction is fear. I do see it as underpinning. Perhaps I see it as more underpinning the need for polarization than you do. Let's this next question. The world is so crazy right now, and we may be dealing with more issues at work, tensions at home, and very real internal conflicts than ever. Many of us are also suffering from burnout. So how do we start the process of dealing with conflict? And of course, I'm reminded that it was Bumble yesterday that sort of they've closed down for a week because of people being in burnout. I think that's a fascinating.
Remind me what Bumble is?
Well, Bumble started as a dating
right. That's what I thought.
In reaction to Tinder,
yeah,
and Match, and it has a very different ethos, and they have a different setting where you can meet up with possible business people. So it's not just about dating, and in the love context, there's other parts of it. It's been very successful.
Well, I mean that leads. You know, there's quite a lot in your question. You know, at one level, in terms of craziness, yes. At another level, I have the luxury of not living in a city at the moment, and at a whole other level, there's a whole lot of reduced choice, but still a lot of calmness. At least there have been, but that's not to discount the underlying uncertainty that I think exists. So, yeah, I mean, yeah, without getting philosophical, I think the core of your question is about working with conflict and burnout. And my view, and again, I did a master's in psychology, but I'm more interested in the framing that people go into around conflict, and not so much about, there's so much research into how we physically are embodied and feeling beings as well as thinking beings, and how much this affects our thoughts. And that burnout is often the result of not allowing and not accepting the physical and the feeling side of our experience, which is, I think, far more likely if you're somebody who now spends a lot more time in front of a digital screen than before. And I would say that even before COVID, digital screen use is up, and there is correlations between that and depression, you know, suicide rates in young, you know, especially young adolescent women. So that, you know, the first part of it is, you know, we're sort of heading in that trajectory. And, you know, my first tip to avoid burnout, whether it's at all realistic, is maybe not to leave social media altogether, but its very nature to notice that it works off polarizing, and that most people on social media don't care about what you think. They more care about sort of scoring points for them for a short-term win. And there's not very few people are interested in having a nuanced dialogue on social media. And I think they're more interested in point scoring for the stuff that I've seen, you know, and I don't think that that's healthy. I think it's very engaging, but I do think that it prompts people to get caught up in in a particular view of their experience, which you don't have when you're, when I'm playing with my son, for example, which I'm lucky enough to have the time to do. So there is a technological component to the burnout, which I think we need to be wary of. Technology is also a great way of people getting access to things. So I'm not saying it's completely bad, but I would say be careful of how we're using it, especially as a way of remedying our uncertainty and our pain. Because what we do is we go on and we look for certainty, and we'll find our tribes and reassert them. And I think social media tends to exacerbate that rather than soothe.
There's also been a very big drive amongst an awful lot of organizations to enhance their technology as a result of the pandemic and so on. And it is a natural response, but actually I would really query whether it's going to help long term. Technology is not the answer, because particularly if it dehumanizes, and we're talking about AI and bots and their effect.
So we're going off. That was one answer about burnout. Is about one of the things that I think contributes is to probably high amounts of screen time in general, but probably being engaged in for long periods of time, being engaged in sort of arguments that don't have much space in social. One of the things that we do as human beings is when we communicate, we experience not just the words that are being said, but the moods through which people convey them. And so it's very hard to appreciate the humanity of somebody when all you're reading is their text. And I think that escalates the polarizing. So we've been talking about a lot about the downside of polarizing, and I think you've got to catch it and then go, right, get clear about, well, let me take this and let me take my bit. And I think people use social media in a way to explore that, go, I'm going to polarize it a bit more. And if I'm to be generous, I think that helps people try and clarify their thinking. What does tend to happen is a lot of the responses are attacks rather than inquiries.
Yeah, because and I'm not sure it does clarify people's thinking. Honestly, I don't. It's that seeking. We're going back to the beginning. It's that seeking of certainty. So you latch on to something that you say, yes, I agree with that. I don't think it helps you actually clarify your own mind. It helps you to polarize, and that's the whole thing, I think, about where we're at. I mean, you and I, when we get together, we can have some really, really good conversations, and I'm conscious of the time.
And as long as we're not just two white middle-aged men, middle-class men, pontificating on the world, when some people do suffer a lot more in this polarizing world than definitely I and probably you are at the moment.
And I completely agree with that. But that's what activates me, is that feeling of frustration that, it's like with this government that we have, there's this sort of deeply ingrained conservative idea that if somebody is on the streets, it's because they're a layabout and they're not prepared to go and get a job.
The triumph of individualism. We can all go and have the life we want because everything is up to us, and therefore we have all the opportunities in the world. And I guess that's the shadow, as if by discounting how interdependent we are, we then don't see the other needs that we have and that other people have.
Precisely. So let me ask you another one. We're a little bit tight for time now, but can colleagues work in a healthy way with conflict? Because not all conflicts can be resolved.
No, and you're talking about at work, which is, adds a string to the bow, which is, in some ways, you're working with people that you might not choose to do. And work is a great melting pot. I actually think you get the workplace as it used to be meant that you interacted with a lot of different people, much more so than we would necessarily socially. Most people fall foul of their affinity bias and like people like themselves and gravitate towards their tribe for social reasons. And work's great because work means that you have to work with people who have different views. If we link back to that question earlier, going, is the business world becoming more polarized? I do worry a little that, and it started to happen with Brexit, that political views are starting to become so connected to identity that people are stopping to talk to each other.
Yeah.
Now, at work, there's the other thing, which is you're now meeting with somebody and you've got to do a job. And I think that, it's a difficult choice because work is a very important part of people's lives. And when you're in conflict at work, it's difficult to be in conflict, especially if it's hurtful for anybody at any time. But it's difficult at work when you're constantly having to be in contact and work with these people. And I think that, I guess the question I'd always be interested in is your satisfaction and purpose that you derive from being at work with this colleague, the values of the business, worth achieving over your need for self-preservation, like your comfort and your idea of what's safe and what's right and what's good, and is the conflict, is it of a nature that you can do that? And if it is, I think you can find a way. And if it isn't, then that's going to be very difficult. And I think some people will have to make the choice to not. And then if it's their workplace, that's not an easy thing. So I think the workplace conflict's really difficult because work gives us so many needs apart from money. It gives us socialization, it gives us meaning, it gives us confidence.
Exactly, meaning, because I think for a lot of people, they get their sense of identity through the nomenclature that people refer to them as.
And that's why they take it so personally at work when they're in conflict with somebody.
Yeah.
Because they're so vested. Everyone's really invested in the company or what they're trying to do that these attacks can feel so personal when in fact they're probably not. But when you've got to live with that person, and it's very difficult.
So a lot of business leaders are having to have some very difficult conversations with their staff right now. What would you suggest they bear in mind?
It's really tricky for some leaders in business. People are looking up to them. They feel they have a responsibility. And at the same time, they're feeling the pressure, not just of supporting their teams, but also their own personal uncertainties with work. As well, if they're an aware leader, knowing that how they behave is also going to have an impact on their teams. So, I admire leaders at the moment who are walking that line well. And I think one of the ways that they walk that line well is to be authentic with their own experience to the extent that it's empathic, and also find what they can in terms of how they're going to do something about it. And, in terms of difficult conversations with their teams, again, people are looking for the leaders to know the answer. And another thing is, when can the leader also find time to ask them what they need? And that's probably one of these they need to be doing.
Dichotomies that you have, where leaders are being encouraged to be vulnerable, because it's in that vulnerability that you can really create empathy. And yet at the same time, some people see a leader being vulnerable, and they think this guy doesn't know what he's doing, and they lose confidence because what they're looking for is the answer. Again, we're back to the polarization. Tell me what the answer is, and then I can get on with it. Don't give me ambiguity. Don't tell me you're not sure, because how does that leave me feeling?
Yeah. So it's an unenviable position. I'm not currently leading a team, so I'm probably not fit to comment, but I know that I am working with leaders who are facing that challenge, and those that step up are finding a really nice balance of communicating a lot and being a little empathic to being a little bit vulnerable in order to allow others to be vulnerable. Because I think if a leader isn't vulnerable at all, and they're asking what they can do for their team, or they're trying to resolve problems in their team, but the leader's not being willing to be vulnerable, the model is in vulnerability. So why should I lead that? And so the leader's got to start with something. And the leaders I've seen who've done that at the right level, and it's a real gift, are the ones who create openness for people to look at the problems as they face them. And then once they've got the problems on the table, they can feel included and sympathized with, to the point that they're then ready to go, okay, now what's needed, and re-energized. So, that's what I'd be looking at. Easier said than done.
Yeah, easier said than done. But I think there's a lot of wisdom in what you've just said. And on that note, I think we've run out of time. So, Edward, thank you so much. We're really looking forward to you exploring this topic some more in the dialogue on the 15th of July. If anybody's interested, please go to Eventbrite in the comments below. And we really look forward to seeing you there and having the dialogue afterwards, where people can really explore their thoughts, having heard you. So thank you.
Great, because let me just, because it's not going to be me talking like this in the talk. It's going to be much more interactive, and I'll be taking a little bit less of a talking position, but I will definitely share some thoughts. Looking forward to it. We're going to look at the three layers, as I said. The positional, the personal, and the process. So I look forward to sharing that with the audience then. Thanks a lot, Thom. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Well, see you then.
Great.